The first time a German officer called me primitive, I was standing in the guard tower at Camp Florence, Arizona, watching the sunset paint the Sonoran Desert in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of home. It was September 1944, and the temperature was still pushing 90 degrees even though the sun was going down. I could hear coyotes starting their evening songs in the distance, and for just a moment, I forgot I was supposed to be watching 1,200 German prisoners instead of listening to the land speak the way my grandfather had taught me. I am Sergeant Major William Cherokee Ridge, 45th Infantry Division, United States Army. But before I wore this uniform, before I carried an M1 Garand across Sicily and up the Italian peninsula, before I became one of the few Native American soldiers trusted with top-secret communications work, I was just Billy Ridge from the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. My people had been walking this land for thousands of years before there was an America to fight for. But when my country called, I answered without hesitation. The nickname Cherokee wasn't something I chose. It was given to me by my unit after the landing at Anzio, when I'd used my native language over the radio to coordinate artillery strikes while German intelligence officers listened in complete confusion. They thought I was speaking some kind of complex code. I was just speaking the language my grandmother taught me, the same language the United States government had tried to beat out of me in boarding school 20 years earlier. But that September evening in 1944, standing in that guard tower with the desert wind carrying the scent of creosote and sage, I had no idea that my real war was about to begin, not with bullets and artillery, but with something far more challenging, teaching the so-called master race that the primitive savage they'd been told about was more civilized than they'd ever imagined. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand how a Cherokee soldier from Oklahoma ended up becoming a teacher, a translator, and eventually something close to a friend to the very men who'd been fighting to destroy everything I believed in. I was born in 1910 in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, heart of the Cherokee Nation. My grandfather, John Blackfeather Ridge, was a full-blood Cherokee who'd survived the Trail of Tears as a child, that forced march that killed a quarter of our people and broke the hearts of the rest. He taught me the old ways, the stories, the language, the songs that connected us to our ancestors and to the land itself. He taught me that being Cherokee wasn't about the past. It was about carrying forward the wisdom of our people into whatever future we could build. But when I was 7 years old, government agents came to our home and took me to the Sequoia Indian boarding school. The motto over the door said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." They cut my hair, burned my clothes, and beat me every time they caught me speaking Cherokee. The teachers told us we were savages, primitives, that our culture was worthless, and our language was nothing but grunts and howls. For 6 years they tried to erase everything my grandfather had taught me. They nearly succeeded, but every summer when I came home, grandfather would sit with me under the oak trees and patiently rebuild what the school had torn down. He'd speak Cherokee until the words came back to me, tell the old stories until I remembered who I was, teach me the songs until my spirit remembered how to sing. "Billy," he told me one summer evening when I was 13, "they can take away everything but what you carry in here." He tapped my chest. "Your language, your stories, your connection to the ancestors, these things live in your heart. No school can reach that deep unless you let them." Those words saved me. I graduated from that boarding school in 1928, speaking perfect English like they wanted, but still speaking Cherokee in my heart where they couldn't hear it. When the war started in Europe, I watched from Oklahoma with the same concern as every other American. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, I was working as a ranch hand, making $30 a month and sending most of it home to help my mother and younger siblings. I was 31 years old, technically too old for the draft, with a wife and a daughter to support. Nobody would have blamed me for staying home, but my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. "You are Cherokee. We do not abandon our people, even when our people have not always honored us." The United States had taken our land, killed our ancestors, tried to destroy our culture, but it was still our land, still our home, still worth defending. So on December 8, 1941, I walked into the recruiting station in Muskogee and volunteered. The recruiting sergeant, a red-faced man from Texas named Murphy, looked at my enrollment card from the Cherokee Nation and sneered, "We're fighting Germans and Japs, boy, not playing cowboys and Indians. You sure you can handle real combat?" I looked him straight in the eye and said in perfect English, "Sergeant, my people have been warriors for 3,000 years. I think I can manage." He signed me up, probably more amused than convinced. 6 months later, after basic training at Fort Sill and advanced infantry training at Camp Barkley, I shipped out to North Africa with the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbird Division, which was fitting since the Thunderbird was sacred to many Plains tribes, including my Cherokee cousins who'd moved west. I saw my first combat in Sicily in July 1943. We landed at Scogliti and fought our way north through some of the most brutal terrain I'd ever seen. The mountains reminded me of the Ozarks back home, but the heat was something else entirely. Men were dropping from heat stroke before the Germans even had a chance to shoot them. That's when I learned something important. Being Cherokee, being raised to respect the land and understand weather and terrain, gave me an edge that city boys from New York and Chicago didn't have. I could read the land, predict where Germans would set up ambushes, find water when official maps showed none. My platoon started calling me Cherokee, with respect instead of mockery. But the real turning point came at Anzio in January 1944. We'd been pinned down for weeks in that miserable beachhead, German artillery pounding us day and night from the hills above. Our radio communications were compromised. The Germans had captured our code books and were listening to everything we said, sometimes even breaking into our frequencies to give false orders that got men killed. That's when Captain James Whitmore, our company commander, called me to his CP dugout. He was a Yale graduate, smart as a whip, and one of the few officers who treated native soldiers like actual human beings instead of curiosities. "Ridge," he said, lighting a Lucky Strike with hands that shook slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. "I hear you speak Cherokee." "Yes, sir. Fluently." "How many people speak Cherokee?" I thought about it. "Maybe 20,000, sir. Mostly in Oklahoma, some in North Carolina." He smiled, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. "How many of those 20,000 do you think are working for German intelligence?" That's when I understood. For the next 3 months, I became an unofficial code talker, using Cherokee over the radio to coordinate movements, call in artillery strikes, and relay intelligence that the Germans couldn't understand no matter how hard they tried. The language that the United States government had tried to beat out of me in boarding school became one of our most valuable weapons. The irony wasn't lost on me. America had spent decades trying to destroy native languages, calling them primitive and worthless. Now those same languages were helping to win the war. My grandmother would have laughed at the cosmic justice of it all. By September 1944, after 15 months of combat from Sicily through Italy to the liberation of Rome, I was exhausted. I'd been promoted to Sergeant Major, earned a Silver Star for actions at Monte Cassino, and watched too many good men die in mud and blood and chaos. When the Army offered me a position as senior NCO at a POW camp in Arizona, close to home, away from the fighting, a chance to see my wife and daughter more than once a year, I jumped at it. Camp Florence sat in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, about 60 miles southeast of Phoenix. It was a massive facility, designed to hold up to 15,000 German and Italian prisoners, with wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers every 100 yards, and double barbed wire fences surrounding the whole compound. The heat was brutal, 115 degrees in the summer, but at least nobody was shooting at us. My job was straightforward: maintain order, oversee work details, ensure the prisoners were treated according to the Geneva Convention, and serve as a liaison between the American command staff and the senior German officers who ran the internal prisoner organization. Simple, clean, safe. What I didn't expect was that I'd end up teaching Nazi soldiers that the primitive savage they'd been told about had built a civilization while their ancestors were still painting themselves blue and living in caves. The incident that changed everything happened on my 3rd day at Camp Florence. I was conducting an inspection of Compound C, where we housed about 800 German officers and NCOs captured in Italy and France. The senior prisoner was Oberstleutnant Friedrich von Schiller, a tank commander from the 1st Panzer Division, who came from an old Prussian military family and carried himself like he was still commanding troops instead of sitting in an Arizona prison camp. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with iron-gray hair and cold blue eyes that had seen too much killing. He spoke perfect English with a slight British accent. He'd studied at Oxford before the war, and he maintained discipline among the German prisoners with an iron fist wrapped in aristocratic courtesy. "Sergeant Major Ridge," he said when I entered the barracks for inspection, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that only European aristocracy could achieve. "I wish to file a formal complaint." I pulled out my notebook. "Go ahead, Colonel." "It has come to my attention that a primitive is serving in a position of authority over civilized men. This is contrary to the natural order and represents a degradation of military standards." I looked up from my notebook. "Excuse me?" He gestured at me with one elegant hand, his iron cross still pinned to his uniform even in captivity. "You are obviously of Indian extraction, yes? One of the aboriginal peoples of this continent. While I'm sure you are doing your best given your limited background, it is inappropriate for someone of your breeding to exercise authority over European officers." The barracks had gone completely silent. About 50 German prisoners had stopped what they were doing to watch this confrontation. I could feel their eyes on me, wondering how the primitive would respond to being called out by their aristocratic commander. For a moment, just a moment, I was 7 years old again, standing in that boarding school while teachers told me I was a savage who needed to be civilized. I could feel that old shame trying to rise up, that voice that said maybe they were right, maybe I was less than them. But then I heard my grandfather's voice in my memory. "Billy, never let ignorant men define who you are. Show them through your actions, not your anger." I smiled, closed my notebook, and said in a voice that carried through the barracks, "Colonel von Schiller, I understand you're a student of history, given your Oxford education." He looked surprised that I knew about Oxford. "I am." "Then perhaps you can tell me, when your Germanic ancestors were still living in mud huts and painting themselves blue to scare their enemies, what were they doing?" His face flushed red. "That was 2,000 years ago. And 2,000 years ago," I continued, my voice still calm and pleasant, "my Cherokee ancestors had already developed written language, built cities, created democratic forms of government, and established trade networks that spanned a continent. We had agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, while your people were still figuring out that you could plant crops instead of just hunting and gathering." The barracks was absolutely silent now. Several German prisoners were staring at me with open mouths. "So when you talk about natural order and primitive peoples, Colonel, you might want to check your history books. The only difference between your civilization and mine is that yours had better weapons. That doesn't make you more civilized, it just makes you better at killing." Von Schiller's face had gone from red to white. His hands were clenched at his sides, and I could see him struggling with the urge to strike a superior officer. "Prisoner status be damned. Furthermore," I said, "I earned this rank through combat in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome. I've commanded men under fire, made decisions that saved lives, and served my country with honor. You're here because you lost your war. I'm here because we won ours. So I suggest you adjust your attitude about natural order, because in this camp I am the natural order." I turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Colonel, the complaint is denied, dismissed." As I walked out of that barracks, I could hear the stunned silence behind me, then the slow murmur of German conversations starting up. I'd made an enemy of von Schiller, but I'd also planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those prisoners. Maybe the stories they'd been told about racial hierarchies and superior peoples weren't quite as accurate as they'd believed. That night, lying in my bunk in the NCO quarters, I thought about what had happened. I could have reported von Schiller for insubordination, could have had him thrown in isolation, could have made his life miserable, but that wouldn't have changed his mind. It would have just confirmed his belief that might makes right. Instead, I decided on a different approach. If these German prisoners thought Native Americans were primitive savages, I'd show them otherwise, not through punishment or force, but through education and example. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Camp Commander Colonel Robert Harrison, a career officer from Virginia who'd spent most of the war training troops stateside and seemed relieved to have a quiet posting away from the fighting. "Colonel," I said, standing at attention in his office, while a ceiling fan pushed hot air around the room, "I'd like permission to start an educational program for the prisoners." He looked up from his paperwork, surprised. "What kind of educational program, Sergeant Major?" "Cultural education, sir. These men have been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda about racial hierarchies and inferior peoples. I'd like to challenge those beliefs by teaching them about Native American history, culture, and contributions to civilization." Harrison leaned back in his chair, pulling out a pipe and taking his time lighting it. That's an unusual request, Ridge. What makes you think they'd be interested? Curiosity, sir. Most of these men have never met a Native American. I'm probably the first one they've seen outside of Buffalo Bill shows and Western movies. They have all these preconceptions based on propaganda and Hollywood. I'd like to show them the reality. He puffed on his pipe, thinking it over. The Geneva Convention requires us to provide educational opportunities for prisoners. Usually that means English classes or vocational training, but I don't see why cultural education wouldn't qualify. He paused. You think you can do this without causing trouble? Some of these Germans are pretty hardcore in their beliefs. Sir, I spent 15 months fighting Germans in Italy. I think I can handle a classroom full of them in Arizona. He smiled at that. Permission granted. You can use the recreation hall on Thursday evenings. I'll make it voluntary. Any prisoner who wants to attend can come. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in late September, I walked into the recreation hall not knowing if anyone would show up. I'd put up notices in each compound advertising Cultural Lecture Series, The Truth About Native Americans. I'd prepared a presentation covering Cherokee history, culture, language, and contributions to American society. I'd even brought some items from home, a Cherokee basket my grandmother had woven, a traditional hunting knife, and some photographs of Cherokee people in both traditional and modern dress. When I opened the door, I was shocked to find over 200 German prisoners packed into a room designed for 100. They sat on benches, stood along the walls, even sat on the floor in front. Von Schiller was there, sitting in the back with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression. But most of the prisoners looked genuinely curious. I stood at the front of the room, took a deep breath, and began. Good evening. My name is Sergeant Major William Ridge, and I am Cherokee. Tonight I'm going to tell you some things about Native American peoples that you probably haven't heard before. You've been told we're primitive, savage, uncivilized. You've seen us portrayed in your movies as bloodthirsty warriors who scream and attack wagon trains. You've been taught that European civilization brought light to a dark continent of primitives. I paused, looking around the room at all those faces, young and old, skeptical and curious, hostile and open. Everything you've been told is a lie. For the next 2 hours, I took them through Cherokee history, starting with the ancient mound-building cultures that predated European contact by thousands of years. I explained the Iroquois Confederacy's democratic system that influenced the American Constitution. I described Cherokee syllabary, a written language system invented by Sequoyah in 1821 that allowed an entire nation to become literate in less than a generation, something no European country had ever accomplished so quickly. I told them about Cherokee contributions to agriculture, including the Three Sisters farming method that sustained millions of people across the continent. I explained our sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine, our complex trade networks, our advanced metallurgy. By the time Europeans arrived in Cherokee territory, I said, we had permanent towns with council houses, organized government, established laws, agriculture, trade, education, and culture. We weren't primitives waiting to be civilized. We were a functioning civilization with our own systems that had worked for thousands of years. A young prisoner in the front row, couldn't have been more than 20, raised his hand tentatively. Sergeant Major, if your people were so advanced, why did you lose to the Americans? It was a fair question, and I appreciated that he asked it respectfully. Because we didn't have immunity to European diseases, I answered honestly. Smallpox, measles, typhoid. These diseases killed 90% of native populations before any wars even started. Imagine if 90% of Germans died in the first year of this war. Would you have been able to win battles after that? The room went quiet as they processed that information. And even then, I continued, we didn't really lose militarily. The Cherokee Nation signed treaties, negotiated as equal nations, maintained our sovereignty for decades. We only lost because the United States broke every treaty they signed with us, then forcibly removed us from our ancestral lands in what we call the Trail of Tears. I pulled out a photograph of my grandfather that I'd brought from home. This is my grandfather, John Blackfeather Ridge. He survived that forced march as a child. 4,000 Cherokee died during the removal, out of 16,000 who started the journey. That's 25% of our entire nation, killed by exposure, disease, and starvation during a forced relocation that the United States government called Indian removal. The silence in the room was profound. These were men who'd participated in a war of conquest, who'd seen civilians suffer, who'd followed orders that led to atrocities. They understood what I was describing, even if they didn't want to admit it. Von Schiller stood up in the back, his face unreadable. "Sergeant Major Ridge, are you comparing the American treatment of Indians to German policies toward inferior races?" It was a trap question, and I knew it. If I said yes, I'd be implying that America was as bad as Nazi Germany. If I said no, I'd be letting him off the hook for his own beliefs about racial hierarchies. "No, Colonel," I said carefully. "I'm pointing out that every nation has blood on its hands, including America. The difference is that America allowed my people to survive, to maintain our culture, to eventually become citizens with rights. We can vote, own property, serve in the military. Yes, we suffered terrible injustices, but we're still here, still Cherokee, still maintaining our language and culture." I paused, looking directly at him. "Your country's policy toward people you consider inferior isn't about removal or subjugation. It's about extermination. That's the difference, Colonel. America treated my people terribly, but they didn't try to erase us from existence. Your ideology calls for the complete elimination of everyone you deem unworthy. So no, it's not the same thing at all." The room erupted in murmured conversations, prisoners debating with each other in German. Von Schiller sat down slowly, his face still unreadable, but I could see something had shifted in his expression. The sessions continued every Thursday evening for the next 6 months. Word spread through the camp, and attendance grew from 200 to over 500 prisoners, nearly half the camp population. I brought in other Native American soldiers stationed nearby to share their stories. We taught basic Cherokee phrases. We demonstrated traditional crafts, songs, and dances. But more importantly, we had conversations. Deep, meaningful discussions about civilization, culture, race, and humanity that challenged everything these German soldiers had been taught under the Nazi regime. One evening in November, a German captain named Ernst Weber approached me after a session. He was 35, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht and captured at Anzio. "Sergeant Major Ridge," he said in excellent English, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Captain. How do you do it? How do you serve a country that treated your people so terribly? How do you wear that uniform with pride when America tried to destroy your culture?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since the day I volunteered, the question that kept me awake some nights when the weight of it all seemed too heavy to bear. Because America isn't perfect, Captain Weber, but it's capable of becoming better. My people have been here for thousands of years, and we'll be here for thousands more. America is young. It makes mistakes, does terrible things sometimes, but it also has principles written into its founding documents that, if followed, lead to justice and equality. I paused, trying to find the right words. The same Constitution that allowed the Trail of Tears also eventually gave Native Americans citizenship and rights. The same country that tried to destroy our languages in boarding schools now uses those languages to win wars. America is a work in progress, Captain. It's not finished yet. And you believe it can become better? I have to believe that. My daughter is growing up in this country. If I don't work to make it better, what kind of world am I leaving for her? Over the winter months of 1944 and into spring 1945, something remarkable happened in Camp Florence. The educational sessions became genuine dialogues, with German prisoners asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences. Many of them had come from countries with their own minority populations, Sorbs in Germany, Bretons in France, Basques in Spain, and they began to see parallels between how their own countries had treated minorities and how Native Americans had been treated in the United States. The transformation in von Schiller was particularly striking. He started attending every session, sitting in front instead of in back, asking questions instead of making accusations. One evening in March 1945, after a session about Cherokee written language, he stayed behind after everyone else had left. "Sergeant Major Ridge," he said, his aristocratic bearing somehow less rigid than before, "I owe you an apology." I was genuinely surprised. "For what, Colonel?" "For calling you primitive. For my comments when you first arrived. For—" he paused, struggling with something internal. "For believing the lies I was told about racial hierarchies and superior peoples." He sat down heavily on one of the benches, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "I was educated at the best schools in Germany, studied at Oxford, considered myself an enlightened man, but I absorbed Nazi ideology without questioning it, because it confirmed what I wanted to believe, that my people, my class, my background made me superior to others. "What changed your mind?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "These sessions, learning about Cherokee civilization, about the sophistication of your culture, about the contributions native peoples made to the world." He looked at me directly. "But more than that, watching you, the way you conduct yourself with dignity and authority, the way you command respect from American and German soldiers alike, the way you balance pride in your heritage with your duty to your country." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere face. "You embody something my education should have taught me but didn't, that civilization isn't about race or breeding or blood. It's about how you treat others, how you maintain your principles under pressure, how you balance justice with mercy." By May 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Florence, the atmosphere in the camp had changed dramatically. The hardcore Nazis, men like von Schiller had once been, found themselves increasingly isolated as more and more prisoners began questioning the ideology that had led their country to ruin. The Thursday sessions continued through the summer as we processed prisoners for repatriation. Men who'd arrived believing in Aryan supremacy were leaving with a fundamentally different understanding of culture, civilization, and human worth. On one of the last sessions in August 1945, just before the camp began shutting down, over 800 prisoners packed into that recreation hall, more than half the remaining camp population. I'd prepared a final lecture, a summation of everything we'd discussed over the past year. But when I stood up to speak, von Schiller stood up as well. "Sergeant Major Ridge," he said formally, "with your permission, I would like to say something on behalf of the German prisoners of Camp Florence." I nodded, curious what he wanted to say. He turned to face the assembled prisoners, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a commander addressing his troops for the last time. "Gentlemen, in 1 week, most of us will board ships to return to Germany. We will go home to a destroyed country, to cities reduced to rubble, to a nation that must rebuild not just its buildings, but its entire moral foundation." He paused, and I could see emotion working in his face. "When we left Germany, we believed we were the master race, that our culture was supreme, that we had the right to dominate those we considered inferior. We believed the lies we were told about primitive peoples and subhuman races." He gestured toward me. "Then we met Sergeant Major Ridge, a Cherokee warrior who speaks 4 languages, who fought across Europe, who commanded men in combat, who holds rank and respect in the army that defeated us. A man who embodies honor, dignity, and civilization in ways that shame our former beliefs." The room was absolutely silent. He could have used his position to humiliate us, to punish us for the arrogance of our ideology. Instead, he educated us. He showed us the truth about his people, challenged our assumptions, and treated us with a respect we did not deserve and certainly had not shown to others. Von Schiller turned back to face me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Sergeant Major Ridge, on behalf of every man in this room, I thank you. You have given us something more valuable than food or shelter. You have given us the truth. When we return to Germany and begin the work of rebuilding, we will carry with us the lessons you taught us about what true civilization means." He came to attention and saluted, not the Nazi salute, but a proper military salute of respect. Every single prisoner in that room stood and saluted as well. 800 former enemies showing respect to the primitive savage who'd taught them about honor. I returned the salute, my own eyes stinging with tears I hadn't expected to shed. The final transport left Camp Florence in September 1945. As I watched those trucks roll out through the gates, carrying former enemies back to a Germany that would have to rebuild its entire civilization, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. I'd gone to war to defend America, despite everything America had done to my people. I'd fought across Europe, used my primitive language to help win battles, earned respect through combat and leadership. Then I'd come home to teach the master race that they had no monopoly on civilization. 3 months after the camp closed, I received my first letter. It was from Ernst Weber, the schoolteacher from Hamburg. "Dear Sergeant Major Ridge, I am home now, teaching again in a school that is missing half its walls and most of its roof. My students sit on broken chairs at battered desks, learning from books we've salvaged from the rubble. but I teach them different lessons than I taught before the war. I tell them about the Cherokee Nation, about Sequoia and the syllabary, about democratic systems that predate European philosophy. I tell them about you, about the warrior who taught his enemies about honor and civilization. Germany must rebuild more than buildings, Sergeant Major. We must rebuild our understanding of humanity itself. Your lessons are helping us do that. Thank you for showing us that true civilization isn't about race or power. It's about wisdom, honor, and treating all people with dignity. Your grateful student, Ernst Weber. That letter sits in my desk drawer, along with 43 others that arrived over the following years. Letters from former prisoners who'd returned to Germany and were working to build a democratic society based on principles of human equality. Letters from men who'd believed in the master race and now taught their children that all peoples have value and dignity. I served 2 more years in the Army before retiring in 1947. I went home to Oklahoma, back to the Cherokee Nation, and started teaching at the same boarding school that had once tried to beat the Cherokee out of me. But now it was a Cherokee-run school, teaching Cherokee language and history alongside English and mathematics. My grandfather lived to see Germany rebuild as a democracy, to see the civil rights movement begin, to see Native Americans fight for and win recognition of their rights and sovereignty. He died in 1963 at the age of 94, still speaking Cherokee, still telling the old stories, still proud that his grandson had carried Cherokee wisdom into the world. "Billy," he told me shortly before he passed, "you did what warriors have always done. You defended your people and your land. But you did something more. You showed our enemies that we were worthy of respect. That is the greatest victory." Looking back now, I realize that my time at Camp Florence was more important than all my combat service. Winning battles helps win wars, but changing minds helps win peace. Those German prisoners went home with changed hearts, and many of them became the foundation of the democratic Germany that stands as our ally today. The irony isn't lost on me. America tried to destroy native cultures for 100 years, then used those cultures to help win the war, then watched as those cultures helped build the peace. The language they tried to beat out of me in boarding school became a weapon against our enemies. The history they tried to erase became a tool for building understanding. The identity they called primitive became a bridge between former enemies. That September evening in 1944, when von Schiller called me primitive, I could have responded with anger or bitterness. Instead, I chose education. Instead of proving him wrong through force, I showed him the truth through example. That choice rippled out across hundreds of lives, across an ocean, across generations. This was the story of Sergeant Major William Cherokee Ridge, 45th Infantry Division, who volunteered to fight for a country that had tried to destroy his culture, then used that culture to help transform the hearts and minds of enemy soldiers. His experience, documented in camp records and confirmed by dozens of letters from grateful former prisoners, reminds us that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with truth, dignity, and the courage to challenge hatred with education. Ridge's story demonstrates that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from maintaining dignity and principles even when you've been wronged. The Cherokee Nation that suffered the Trail of Tears produced warriors who defended America anyway, not because America deserved it, but because defending your home is what warriors do. What struck you most about William's story? Have you heard similar accounts of Native American service and sacrifice? These personal stories help us understand not just what happened during those crucial years, but how individuals can change the course of history through simple acts of dignity and education. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, we'll be sharing the story of Lieutenant Sarah Sally Henderson, an Army nurse who discovered that healing wounded enemy soldiers required healing her own prejudices first. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.